This is Living Power with Dan Hurst.
Second way is that we accept the conflict. This is such an important one for us to really get. Really, really important. Now, this is Mary. And it's in verses 32 through 34. Mary came to Jesus, where Jesus was, and she fell at his feet, and she said exactly what Martha had said to him. Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. She was blaming him. And when Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in the spirit and greatly troubled. Now, what happened here, he didn't have this discussion with her like he had with Martha. It was a completely different scenario. But what Mary was saying was, Lord, whatever you want is okay. But what she was really saying was, I'm accepting the conflict. I know that I'm blaming you for it. If you had been here, you could have saved his life, but you didn't, so I'm just going to deal with it and move on. It's a subtle thing that happens when we blame God this way, when we accept conflict. We blame Him, we blame God, and then we brush it aside. God, why didn't you do this? Why didn't you solve this problem? God, why didn't you take care of this issue in my life? And then we just kind of brush, okay, I'm just going to go on. We do the same thing with people. We do the same thing with people in our lives. We blame them for something, and then we say, okay, I'm just going to push it aside and just go on. It's not that we pretend that it never happened, although sometimes we take that attitude. But it's just like, I can't deal with it. I don't know what to do with it, so I'm just going to brush it aside and not deal with it. See, when that happens to us, when we do that, it's the same thing that happens when we blame someone for hurting us. When we do that with God, when we say, God, I'm blaming you, but I don't understand it, so I'm just not going to deal with it. It's the same thing we do with people who hurt us. We just say, okay, I'm just going to brush it aside and say, I'm going to let it go and not deal with it. And by doing that, Mary was blaming God, but not resolving the conflict. When we do that with people in our lives, what we're doing is we're still blaming them, but we're not resolving the issue. I'm just going to blame you for it, and then I'm just going to push it aside and not deal with it. Now, the moment you blame someone, there is unresolved conflict in your life. Now, I'm not talking about holding somebody accountable. If there's a responsibility where you have to hold somebody, if you're a boss and you have to hold an employee accountable, that sort of thing. I'm not talking about that. If you're a parent and you have to hold your children accountable, that sort of thing. I'm talking about blaming somebody for doing something and hurting you, that type thing. The moment you blame somebody, it's unresolved conflict. And if you push it aside, then all you have is unresolved conflict that you haven't dealt with. If Jesus had not raised Lazarus from the dead, Mary would have continued to suppress that blame, and it would have eaten her alive. It would have affected her relationship with Jesus in the same way it does if you suppress blame for someone hurting you. When somebody hurts you and you don't resolve it, you don't resolve the issue in your own life, then what happens is it festers below the surface, as those incidents repeat themselves, eventually it will affect how we feel and how we think about that person. So what should you do when there is that conflict, that unresolved blame in your life? Whether it's a conflict with God or with someone else in your life. What should you do? How do you handle that conflict, that unresolved issue, that unresolved blame? Well, I love what Isaiah there are many things that we could go into right here, but it seems to be all put into this amazing little nutshell in Isaiah. Isaiah chapter 58, verses 8 through 10. Look at this. Then shall your light break forth like the dawn, and your healing shall spring up speedily. Your righteousness shall go before you. The glory of the Lord shall be your rear guard. Then you shall call, and the Lord will answer. You shall cry, and He will say, Here I am. Now look at these next few words. If you take away the yoke from your midst, the pointing of the finger, and the speaking of wickedness, If you pour yourself out for the hungry and satisfy the desire of the afflicted, then shall your light rise in the darkness and your gloom be as the noonday. Now, what God was teaching us here through Isaiah was that and you have to do all four of these things. But if you want to deal with blame or unresolved conflict in your life, these issues in your life that you just can't get past with somebody in your life or with God, then there are four things that you need to do. The first one is verse 9. Take away the yoke from your midst. Take away the yoke from your midst. Now, what that's saying is quit making demands of God or others that are based on your personal criteria. The word yoke, we generally think that it's a reference to slavery, and certainly slavery was part of that. But actually what it's a reference to is demanding that people abide by your standards, or demanding that people do what you want them to do. That's what it's referring to. And so in this particular culture at this particular time, these people were requiring people to do certain things and be certain things and behave certain ways and do certain things and say certain things. Sounds a lot like a Baptist church. And you have to abide by this standard, because if you don't, then there's something wrong with you, and you're going to have to be punished for that. And that was this yoke that he's talking about. Take it away. Quit making demands on God and others that are based on your own personal criteria. Demanding or expecting God or others to act a certain way is basically putting a yoke on them. That's the idea. When you have expectations based on God's will and way, it's a completely different story. When your expectations are based on your own criteria, that becomes a yoke. You begin making demands on people's lives that are based on your standards. But when you have expectations based on God's will and way, things change. Same thing for others. Set your expectations based on God's standards. Not even on their standards, but on God's standards. That doesn't mean that you have to approve of other people's standards, but listen, the truth of the matter is, you can't expect a skunk to smell pretty. And so if there are people in your life that are just skunks, they're going to smell like skunks. And you can't expect them to smell pretty and then blame him for not meeting your expectations. Skunks smell like skunks. And so that's the way they're going to smell. And when people are who they are, they're going to act like who they are. And so for putting expectations on them to act a different way is just asking for conflict. Because people are going to act the way they are. That's just the bottom line. Same thing with God. God's going to act the way God is. And if you put expectations on Him and ask Him to act a certain way, you're going to be sadly disappointed. Because God acts like God. So take away the yoke from your midst. Quit putting demands on God and putting demands on people that are based on your own personal criteria. Secondly, stop pointing the finger. Verse 9. Stop the pointing of the finger. In other words, quit accusing and blaming or pointing out or focusing on other people's faults. Even if you're just pointing out those faults to yourself. By the way, this is really important. There's a big difference, you know. You can internalize or externalize the pointing of the finger. This happens a lot in relationships. You know, it's like, honey, what's wrong? I'm not gonna, nothing. Oh yeah. The minute they say nothing, something's wrong. And what happens is it's being internalized. It's not being externalized. And so, and we do this. We begin pointing the finger, holding people guilty for something that they've done that has violated our standards, but we're internalizing it. So even if you just don't express it, even if you just internalize it, you're still pointing the finger. Quit accusing and blaming or pointing or focusing out other people's faults, even if you're just pointing at those faults to yourself, whether it's out loud or whether it's internalized. I love what Proverbs 6 verses 12 through 14 says. A worthless person, stop right there. A worthless person, the word that's used for worthless is not meaning somebody who has no value whatsoever. But there are two kinds of people that are mentioned here. There's the worthless person, and then it is mentioned a wicked man. Two different kinds of people. There are the kinds that are just the value is questionable, and then there are people who are just downright out and out wicked. I mean, they're just evil people. A worthless person, a wicked man, goes about with crooked speech, winks with the eyes, signals with his feet, points with his finger, with perverted heart devises evil, continually sowing discord. Now, I want you to see something very important about this verse. This verse is basically kind of drawing this conclusion. And we can apply the same principle. Sometimes it's external, the wicked man who is doing these things externally where people see these things, or the worthless person who is not making an impact on society. It's more like it's internalized. You can do these things inside of you. You can go about with a crooked speech where you're talking to yourself about this person, in your mind. Like, why does this person do this? Why is this person that way? Why do they say these things? Why is this person trying to hurt me? And so forth and so on. And then they wink with their eyes, signals with their feet, points with the finger. There's the blame game. With perverted heart devising evil, continually sowing discord. But if you've internalized it, where are you sowing the discord? Inside. That's right. You're sowing discord within yourself. So when you internalize that blame, that's what you're doing. That's what Proverbs is talking about. You are like that worthless person. It's all internalized inside. If you're like the wicked person, then you're doing externally. You're causing discord and pointing the finger and speaking and saying these things out loud with a group of people or whatever. So you're externalizing it and causing those problems externally. But if you're like the other person, it's all internal. And when you sow discord, you're sowing discord inside of you. And eventually it begins eating you up. The third thing that's mentioned here is when we're talking about how you solve all it, how you get out of all of this of dealing with the conflict and accepting it and not blaming. The third way is verse 9 is quit speaking wickedness. Now, people who harbor blame at some point let that inner hurt and that frustration out. At some point it's going to come out. Unfortunately, it's usually shared with somebody that has no bearing on the situation. You notice that? At some point, you're going to share this. It's going to come out. Sometimes it's with a person that you have a conflict with. Sometimes it's with God if you have a conflict with God. But there are times when you begin sharing it with someone else. Someone who has absolutely no bearing on the situation whatsoever. And oftentimes, it's just simply shared with somebody in order to gain some release or to let the pressure off or to gain some sympathy, whatever the case may be. But this word, wickedness, is the word awin, and it's a Hebrew word, and it has many, many different meanings. Now, when we use the word wicked in English, it's like evil. This person is wicked. Obviously it means that this person is like the evil of evil. This person is like horrible, horrible person. But in the Hebrew, the word actually has a range of meanings. And in this case, it's the implication is that it's unfavorable circumstances or perhaps a felt injustice. In other words, quit speaking about unfavorable circumstances or quit speaking about your perceived injustice. That's what it's saying. In the context, it's talking about quit speaking about that thing which you consider to be such an injustice in your life. Quit bringing it out and spewing it out. That's not how you solve the problem. Have you ever noticed that blame and worry are basically the same thing? I mean, you worry about something, you go, what am I going to do? How am I going to solve this problem? And Jesus said in Matthew and also in Luke, He said, why do you worry about something? How many of you are going to add any time to your life by worrying? It's not going to happen. And consider the lilies. Even Saul in all his glory was never dressed like the lilies of the field. God knows that you need these things. If you need these things, seek the kingdom of God, and these things will be provided for you. But it's all based on this idea of quit worrying, because it's not going to accomplish anything. And the same principle is true with blame. What does blame accomplish? Worrying is not going to add any time to your life. If anything, it's going to take time off of your life. Blame is the same way. What is it going to accomplish? It's not going to add anything to your life. If anything, it's going to take time off of your life. And if I'm holding somebody, if I'm blaming somebody for something, let's say I'm mad at Gene for something. Gene, there's probably a bunch of things we could come up with here, but I'm going to blame Gene for something. And I'm just, I can't believe she's like that. I can't believe, what is wrong with that person? Why would she act like, why would she say something like that? And I'm just, am I taking any time off of Gene's life? Am I affecting Gene's life? How is it changing Gene's life other than she may know, maybe she doesn't know, that I'm upset with her? But who is it really affecting? Me. Same thing with worry. If I'm worried about something, then it affects me. It doesn't affect the person that I'm really worried about or the situation that I'm worried about. So worry and blame are pretty much, they're not the same thing, but they have the same basic effect. And when you start talking about that and you start harboring that in your life, then what you do is you are speaking of that injustice, that felt injustice, and it's not solving anything. It's just affecting you. But here's what God says you should do about that blame that you harbor. We've seen the first three things. Take away the yoke from your midst. Stop pointing the finger. Stop speaking wickedness. And then here's the fourth thing, verse 10. Pour yourself out for the hungry and afflicted. Pour yourself out for the hungry and afflicted. Why? Because when you do, your light will rise in the darkness and your gloom be as the noonday. What an amazing statement. What a remarkable promise from God. You see, here's what God is saying. When you begin meeting people's needs, it will completely change your perspective and your heart. When your focus is on meeting people's needs as opposed to the conflict, that unresolved conflict in your life, that blame that you've been dealing with in your life, when you begin focusing on meeting people's needs, it completely changes your perspective and your heart. When you begin to see God at work in you and through you, suddenly the injustice against you seems so small compared to what God is up to. Same thing is true when you're dealing with people who have offended you, people who have hurt you. When you take this, what God is saying, and you begin pouring yourself into meeting people's needs, maybe not the person that you have the problem with, but certainly when you focus on meeting people's needs and focusing on the hungry and the afflicted, when you begin people's meeting needs, suddenly you begin to develop a whole different heart, a whole different perspective. And when you see that God is using you, you begin to see those things that you blamed Him for in a completely different light. Suddenly, your ministry becomes more important than your circumstances. And to understand the impact of that, to understand the impact of what this does for you, let's go back to the beginning of that verse, that passage there in verse 9. Look at this in verse 9, or verse 8, Then shall your light break forth like the dawn, and your healing shall spring up speedily. Healing from what? From all that blame has been doing to you inside, the way it's been eating you up. And notice that it uses the word speedily. It doesn't take long. When your focus becomes right, when you begin focusing on what it is that God wants to accomplish in and through your life, when you begin focused on meeting people's needs, taking care of the afflicted, when you begin focusing on that, the light breaks forth in your life, and your healing begins to spring up speedily. And your righteousness will go before you. Righteousness, remember, the things that you do because of what God's calling is on your life. Your righteousness goes before you. You find these things. God begins putting these things in your life for you to do. You begin to see that you have a calling. You have a ministry. You have a purpose. You have a plan. And the glory of the Lord will be your rear guard. In other words, God says, I'll be there. I'll be there to protect you. I'll be there to encourage you. I'll be your strength. Then you shall call, and the Lord will answer. Notice that. Notice that it's then. Sometimes we wonder why God hasn't answered us, because we haven't gotten to the then. There are some things that have to happen before we get to the then in our lives. And so, then you shall call, and the Lord will answer. And you shall cry, and He will say, here I am. Don't you long for that in your life? That here I am? When you call out to God and you wonder where He is and why things aren't happening the way they're supposed to, and why is this happening in my life right now, and why are these circumstances though? Aren't you longing for that here I am from God? Yeah, you are. How do you get to that? Everything that we've talked about here. And then you shall call, and the Lord will answer. You shall cry, and He will say, here I am.
On behalf of Dan Hurst and the Open Class, we want to thank you for watching. We hope it was a blessing.